of the studio, the kind of artificial brightness that stripped away pretenses and magnified every twitch, every blink, every tremor of exposed confidence. It was meant to be a routine segment, a 10-minute crossfire exchange stitched into the fabric of a news cycle swollen with noise. But this one didn't just cut through, it ripped. Karoline Leavitt had taken her seat early, still and poised. There was no warm-up smile, no illusion of soft ground beneath the surface. She wasn't there to pander, and the line of her jaw made that unmistakably clear. Across from her, Robert De Niro adjusted his collar, a practiced flick of the wrist, the faintest smile creasing his face. Less charm, more warning. Cameras hadn't even rolled yet, but the tension between them had already thickened into something almost chemical. When the segment opened, the host barely got past the introduction before De Niro leaned forward. He wasn't waiting for a question. The problem, and he said, is that people like her pretend to know what they're talking about. You throw in the buzzwords, you sell the illusion of certainty, and you confuse the public. The audience didn't clap. They didn't boo either. Silence, that kind bred from anticipation rather than confusion, filled the space. Karoline didn't blink. You played Vito Corleone, not Voltaire, she said, each word delivered without haste, without tremor. Acting doesn't come with a PhD, Robert. And the last time I checked, shouting at people on red carpets doesn't make you a constitutional scholar. It hit with the precision of a scalpel. De Niro narrowed his eyes, but he didn't speak. She leaned slightly forward, calm, unblinking. You say I throw around buzzwords? Let's talk about the words you throw around. Dictator, traitor, Nazi. You throw them like grenades into every room you enter, hoping the blast will drown out your lack of substance. I don't confuse the public. I challenge them. You, on the other hand, entertain them into stupor. De Niro raised a hand like he was calling cut on a set. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're 20-something, barely out of school, and you're a millionaire actor pretending to be a prophet, she said. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I studied policy. I worked in communications at the White House. You starred in a movie about boxing and now think you're qualified to lecture America on foreign policy? The host was frozen. A hand hovered over the desk, unsure whether to mediate or just let the fire burn. No one cut to commercial. De Niro opened his mouth, then closed it. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. Karoline continued, each sentence sharp, each pause purposeful. You've spent the last 8 years doing press tours on talk shows, calling half the country fascists and the other half idiots. You don't want conversation, you want applause. But here's the problem with live TV, Robert. There's no script. You're not in character anymore. And without a script, your lines fall flat. There was a shift in the studio. Not audible, not visible, but unmistakable. De Niro leaned back. Not in confidence. Retreat. The host finally managed a question, something about polarization, but it came out flimsy, almost irrelevant. Karoline turned to the camera. If you think people are angry now, wait until they realize the conversations they're allowed to have are being dictated by men who pretend for a living and scold for fun. De Niro's face flushed. He leaned back in again, this time with something less measured, less rehearsed. You think you're special because you yell louder than the rest? You're a symptom of the disease, not the cure. And you, Karoline said, are the Hollywood placebo, loud, shiny, and utterly ineffective. That's when he slammed his hand against the armrest. The mic caught it, a sharp, involuntary burst of frustration. He muttered something hot and fast under his breath. The audio picked it up. Every outlet clipped it within minutes. By the end of the hour, it had more views than his last 3 films combined. But Karoline didn't even flinch. She had already turned back to the host, who now looked like he regretted ever booking the segment. You want to talk about unity? She said. Then stop putting celebrities on a pedestal like they have moral authority. They live in gated mansions and hire armed guards while lecturing the rest of us about privilege and violence. The public is catching on. That's what makes them furious. The fury wasn't theoretical anymore. De Niro's face was red, his hand still twitching from the blow to the chair. For a moment it looked like he might leave, but he stayed. Pride, perhaps, or ego. Maybe he thought she'd eventually falter, but she didn't. Over the next 40 minutes, Karoline dismantled him piece by piece, without ever raising her voice, without ever shifting in her seat. She quoted statistics, named specific legislation, referenced historical precedent. When he tried to pivot to January 6, she brought up the 2020 riots and asked how many arrests he had condemned on air. He stammered. When he invoked morality, she asked him to define it. His version, not the one from a screenplay. The internet exploded. Clips flooded TikTok, YouTube, X. Her calm stare as he fumbled. His rising temper. The moment she called him the loudest voice in a room full of yes men. Hashtags exploded. Nyanar Karoline crushed it. Just, De Niro destroyed. Ars live meltdown. Within hours, it wasn't just trending, it was cultural oxygen. Some pundits called it a masterclass, others called it a disgrace. De Niro's PR team tried to spin it, claiming he'd been baited, but the footage said otherwise. No edits, no jump cuts, just raw, unfiltered collapse. Karoline didn't celebrate. She didn't post a follow-up. She disappeared from the press circuit for a few days. Her silence only made the story grow. Within 48 hours, petitions were circulating, some demanding De Niro apologize, others demanding networks stop inviting actors as political voices altogether. But it didn't end there, because the clip had done more than expose a generational divide or a partisan line. It had torn open a cultural fissure. It raised an uncomfortable question. What happens when celebrity meets informed resistance? Not outrage, not shouting, just someone who knows the facts and doesn't flinch. And Karoline Leavitt, in that moment, became something different. Not just a political figure, not just a conservative voice, but a litmus test. And De Niro, for all his legacy, for all his triumphs, he became a warning. It was the silence after the broadcast that said the most, not De Niro's silence. His camp issued a brief, defiant press release claiming he was ambushed by right-wing theatrics. Not the media's silence. Networks scrambled to replay the clip, frame by frame, like it was the Zapruder film of generational political collapse. The real silence came from the power brokers, the cultural tastemakers who usually flooded the air with commentary, satire, and snide dismissal. This time they hesitated. They weren't sure how to play it. Karoline hadn't ranted. She hadn't spewed conspiracies. She had quoted legislation, referenced Supreme Court rulings, cited polling data, then delivered each line with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the fault lines were and how to press her weight against them. By dawn, her name was unavoidable. News feeds glowed with headlines like Leavitt versus De Niro, Culture Clash of the Decade, and The Night the Actor Got Outacted. Opinion pages flared with speculation. Was this the turning point in the credibility of celebrity activism, or just another viral moment destined to burn out in 24 hours? But it didn't burn out. It calcified. Clips circulated in loops. Edits dropped De Niro's past speeches in beside Karoline's takedown. A side-by-side of his anti-Trump tirades next to her calm rebuttals drew millions of views within hours. Memes surfaced. TikTok flooded with reaction videos. Teens reenacting her lines. Comedians impersonating De Niro's meltdown. But deeper still, something more unnerving stirred. Political forums, once dismissive of her youth, began framing Karoline as a legitimate force. Think pieces emerged, many reluctantly, from left-leaning analysts asking whether we've underestimated her. At the center of the firestorm, Karoline remained still. No tweets, no press conferences, no celebratory retweets. She wasn't feeding the storm. She was watching it grow. Inside political war rooms, Democratic, Republican, and everything in between, the De Niro incident was being dissected like battlefield footage. One strategist called it a nuclear moment in the optics war. Another, caught off mic, admitted, she cracked the code. She didn't just win the exchange, she rewrote the rules. What followed was the fallout. De Niro's next scheduled appearance, a film premiere in Manhattan, turned into a minefield. Protesters lined the barricades, not for the film, but for the moment. Some chanted, "We're done with Hollywood," while others held signs quoting Karoline's lines, "You're the placebo." Inside, De Niro made no public remarks, but photographers caught the image. Jaw tight, shoulders hunched, surrounded by handlers trying to look indifferent. Behind the scenes, agents panicked. Studios began questioning whether De Niro's political outspokenness was worth the risk anymore. Streaming executives whispered about brand safety, audience trust, stockholder response. One email leak, later verified, revealed that a top-tier producer had advised a media conglomerate to cool the spotlight on overt celebrity activism until the Leavitt thing dies down. But it wasn't dying down. 3 days after the interview, Karoline's team announced a town hall event. No Hollywood, no cable anchors, just her, a microphone, and a crowd of undecided voters in Ohio. The hall filled within 15 minutes. People were bussed in from 2 states over. The event wasn't flashy, it wasn't angry, it was clinical, precise, pointed, and it was streamed over 3 million times within 24 hours. Opponents scrambled. They tried to reframe her as disrespectful, divisive, overly aggressive, but the footage didn't support them. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't gloated, she had sat there cool as marble, while an aging icon sputtered and raged. And now the real storm began. Talk show hosts, sensing blood in the water, started inviting her, hoping to trip her, bait her, find the one moment she'd overreach. But she didn't. In every interview, she stayed focused, calm, clear, no theatrics, just message. Every jab from a host was countered with clarity. Every loaded question answered with facts. When one anchor tried to corner her by quoting De Niro's past accolades, she replied, "I respect his career, but we're not in a movie. This is real life, and real life doesn't follow a script." It went viral again. The old guard panicked. De Niro backed into a corner, went on the defensive. He appeared on a late-night show, fuming and unapologetic, spitting out lines about dangerous youth movements and ignorant provocateurs. But it came off brittle, forced, tired. The applause was polite. The ratings were not. Meanwhile, Karoline's reach stretched. College campuses invited her. Moderates started citing her. Independent voters began shifting. Some polls, quietly, reluctantly, showed her approval rising. The movement was no longer fringe. It was accelerating. But what unsettled her opponents most wasn't her popularity. It was her discipline. She didn't take the bait. She didn't chase the limelight. She let the storm come to her, and then when it did, she stood unmoved, letting the winds blow themselves out around her. Inside the Beltway, that restraint was terrifying. One senior strategist whispered to a journalist, off record, "She's the most dangerous kind of opponent, not because she's loud, but because she's strategic." And now, thanks to De Niro, everyone knows her name. And Karoline? She didn't smile in public. She didn't post victory laps or self-congratulations. She simply booked another town hall, another campus visit, another interview. And every time someone asked her about that night with De Niro, she answered the same way. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm here to represent the Americans who are tired of being talked down to by people who pretend to understand them." But the humiliation had already happened. It had been televised, uploaded, shared, immortalized. And in its place, a new reality was taking shape, one where the old playbook no longer worked. And she was writing the new one, line by line. The media didn't sleep. It couldn't afford to. Karoline's rise wasn't meteoric. It was methodical, and that made it more dangerous. They understood the rules of a quick-burn viral star, the kind that exploded online and faded before morning. But Karoline was different. She wasn't a meme. She was a message. And the longer she stayed silent, the louder the system roared to crush her. The first attempt came quietly, an anonymous background profile that ran in a prominent Sunday paper. It led with questions. What does Karoline Leavitt really believe? Who is backing her? It painted her with the usual brush, sharp-tongued, ambitious beyond her years, uncomfortably comfortable in a world of old men's politics. But something about it fell flat. Readers didn't see scandal. They saw fear. The quotes were vague, the sources hidden behind phrases like, "according to those familiar," and, one former colleague said, there were no smoking guns, only shadows pretending to be substance. Still, networks followed the signal. A primetime anchor hinted at disturbing patterns in her rhetoric. Another framed her rise as a symptom of rising authoritarian populism. They invited panels, 4 against 1, Experts, activists, cultural critics. They layered the screen with graphics of De Niro's accolades and Leavitt's ties to former staffers from the previous administration. But it all looked transparent, like an old machine groaning to life, clanking its parts in full view of a public that had already stopped being impressed. Karoline never blinked. When asked to respond to the profile, she said simply, "I've read worse on Twitter." It didn't help that each time the media struck, her support base grew more galvanized. They didn't see a woman being exposed. They saw a young woman being hunted, and that changed the calculus. Mothers in suburbia, who had once leaned left, began to ask why their daughters were being told to sit down. College students who hadn't voted before started quoting her. Small-town mayors who once viewed her as a novelty now saw her as an inevitability. The second wave was more aggressive. A viral clip was pushed, spliced and trimmed, made to look like Karoline had stumbled in an interview. The headline screamed, "Leavitt flubs on foreign policy question." But then the full clip surfaced, untrimmed, unedited, and it showed the opposite. She had corrected the host's false statistic mid-question, then cited a source live on air. The retraction was printed quietly in small print. But it didn't matter. The damage wasn't hers, it was theirs. Every swing that missed exposed the desperation behind it. Inside editorial meetings, panic seeped through the seams. They had overplayed their hand. The public no longer trusted them to referee the game. And Karoline wasn't fighting them with rage. She was starving them with silence. No press wars, no counter articles. Just another appearance, another message, another round of applause. They pivoted to surrogates. Academics published op-eds warning of the Leavitt effect, a term hastily coined to frame her as a cultural contagion. Late-night comedians mocked her glasses, her cadence, her lack of charisma. One did a skit where she was portrayed as a robot repeating talking points, but when Karoline was asked about it at a town hall, she smiled slightly and said, "If I'm a robot, they should worry, because I'm still outperforming them." The crowd erupted. They tried to laugh her away. They failed. But the darkest attempt came when they pushed the story too far. A former acquaintance from high school came forward, claiming Karoline once expressed a controversial opinion during a classroom debate. The story was vague, the quote unverified, but it hit the headlines within hours. And this time, Karoline responded. Not with lawyers, not with outrage. She walked into a televised debate that evening and said, "If the worst thing they can find on me is something I said at 17 in a civics class, that says more about them than me. I'm not ashamed of thinking critically. I'm ashamed we've created a culture where a young woman's childhood is mined like a crime scene just because she dared to speak on equal ground with a Hollywood icon." It hit like thunder. No one interrupted her. No one dared. And something cracked that night, not in her, but in them. Because the more they struck, the more she grew. And it wasn't just her base anymore. It was independents, first-timers, disillusioned centrists, even a few on the left who privately whispered that, despite everything, she had a point. They may have disagreed with her politics, but they respected her discipline, her refusal to apologize for existing. And De Niro, he vanished. The next press event was canceled. His team blamed scheduling conflicts. His next interview, pre-recorded, edited, safe, he hadn't recovered from the hit because it hadn't just been a bad moment, it had been a reveal. And the internet had a long memory. Inside media control rooms, producers whispered of fatigue, not Karoline's but theirs. The playbook wasn't working. She wasn't crumbling. She was coalescing. And through it all, Karoline said nothing reckless. She didn't threaten. She didn't brag. She didn't waver. Instead, she spoke softly, with data, with poise, with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to convince, but only needed to show up. The industry had underestimated her, and now it feared her. There were meetings, dozens of them, some official, others private, off the record, without minutes or transparency. They were held in corners of Capitol buildings, in Manhattan conference rooms, in secluded wings of broadcast headquarters where no one asked questions and everyone knew better than to take notes. Karoline Leavitt had done more than embarrass Robert De Niro. She had exposed the establishment's vulnerability, and that shook them harder than they were willing to admit. Not because she was loud, not because she was extreme, but because she had said what too many feared to say, and said it better than anyone had expected her to. Party leaders on both sides watched the fallout from the De Niro confrontation with alarm, though for different reasons. Democrats saw a threat wrapped in civility. Republicans saw a disruptor they couldn't control. She wasn't part of any club. She didn't owe favors. She wasn't groomed by any machine. And worse, she wasn't failing. That terrified them. Behind closed doors, GOP veterans began whispering concerns. Some liked her, yes, admired her nerve. But admiration was not loyalty, and loyalty was currency. She wasn't spending it. She wasn't asking them for approval. She was bypassing the hierarchy entirely, going straight to the public. Direct, viral, immune to the old games. One senator, old and brittle with influence, said it plainly during a donor event. She's dangerous, not because she's wrong, but because she doesn't need us. Others nodded. Meanwhile, Democratic strategists scrambled for a counterattack that didn't feel hollow. Every traditional attack, sexism, inexperience, populist rage, collapsed under the footage. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't angry. She wasn't running on fear. She was making arguments, hard, cold, bulletproof. Think tanks commissioned psychological profiles. Media groups studied her cadence, her eye movements, her debate rhythm. One analyst wrote a report titled "The Calculated Calm of Karoline Leavitt." It was never published publicly, but it circulated. The conclusion was stark. She does not bluff. She waits. And in that waiting, the cracks widened. Inside the Republican National Committee, staffers fought over strategy. Should they support her? Should they ignore her? Should they absorb her momentum or sabotage it? The old guard, used to steering from the shadows, found themselves unable to make the calculations stick. Because for the first time in years, the base wasn't looking at them. It was looking past them, at her. At rallies that weren't even hers, chants broke out. Let Karoline speak. She didn't organize them. She didn't ask for the mic. But when she was handed it, the rooms changed. There was one moment, unplanned, that turned insiders cold. A veteran congressman paused mid-speech at a conservative forum, flustered by a protester. Karoline, standing off stage, approached quietly. She didn't take the spotlight. She simply whispered something in his ear, then turned to the protester and said, "You've made your point. Let him finish." The room fell silent. The protester sat down. No security, no shouting. Just control. Quiet. Total. Cameras caught it. The clip exploded. A power she wasn't demanding, but one the public was already giving her. And then came the betrayal. It wasn't from the left. It wasn't from Hollywood. It was from inside her own party. An op-ed appeared in a major conservative outlet, signed by a well-known strategist, once a vocal supporter. It read, "Karoline Leavitt is brilliant, bold, and premature." It cloaked itself in praise, but dripped with condescension. It warned of the dangers of haste, the need for mentorship, the value of restraint. It urged her to wait her turn. Wait, that word. It set fire to every corner of her support base. People didn't want her to wait. They'd waited long enough. For clarity, for honesty, for someone who didn't speak in slogans or bend to handlers. And now the machine wanted her to freeze, so it could catch up. She didn't respond, not publicly. But at her next appearance, she did something deliberate. Midway through a panel, an older politician interrupted her. She let him. Then once he finished, she smiled and said, "If the solution to our problems is waiting, then we're not serious about solving them." The audience didn't cheer. They stood, silent, watching her. And the strategist who wrote the op-ed? His inbox flooded with angry messages. One donor pulled funding from his PAC. Another issued a statement of support. For her, it had begun. Realignment. The very structure of power, once immune to a single person's momentum, began to bend. Not break, not yet, but bend. And in the bending, the shadows twisted. Opposition researchers were hired, quietly. Some were told to find anything. College essays, family disputes, dorm rumors. One was caught digging into sealed court records. Nothing stuck. But the act itself exposed the level of desperation. Karoline didn't retaliate. She stayed in the open, spoke softly, smiled rarely, but every smile that didn't come unnerved them more, because she was still gaining, still speaking to rooms that used to belong to senators and governors and icons. And every time she left a room, she left it changed. And De Niro? He stayed gone. The studios stopped offering statements. His next film premiere was postponed. His team said rescheduling issues. But the industry knew he'd become a symbol of a war lost in one sentence, of a system caught unprepared. And Karoline Leavitt, she hadn't even raised her voice. It wasn't a summit. It wasn't a roundtable. They called it a unity forum, a euphemism for containment, held in D.C., hosted by a centrist policy institute with ties on both sides of the aisle. The guest list was curated with surgical care. Old power, new faces, rising media stars, and one name they debated over until the very last hour: Karoline Leavitt. She accepted the invitation without ceremony, no press release, no comment. That unsettled them. They wanted to provoke hesitation, self-doubt. What they got was silence, the kind that forces people to start second-guessing their own strategy. They placed her dead center in the seating chart, flanked by former cabinet secretaries, a network anchor, a Silicon Valley lobbyist, and 3 senators, 2 of whom had openly questioned her fitness to speak at such a platform. That was the point. They weren't inviting her in. They were daring her to slip. The topic was national identity, a broad canvas, enough for everyone to rehearse the usual. Unity, history, growth, polarization, healing. The plan was simple: smother her with legacy, make her feel small by speaking in grand declarations from decades past. Leave her no air. The room was choreographed. Until she spoke. No notes, no podium. Just her voice, low and anchored. I've been told that I don't understand this country because I'm young, that I need to wait my turn, that I haven't lived enough history to know what's at stake. But maybe what's at stake isn't history. Maybe it's honesty. The air thinned. I don't think Americans are divided because they hate each other. I think they're divided because they're tired of being managed, spoken to in riddles, told that the system is complicated. It's not, it's just crowded, with people too comfortable to leave and too scared to change. She didn't blink. You don't need a committee to say what's broken. You just need courage to fix it. And you don't get courage from tenure or titles. You get it from being close enough to the fallout to feel it. They had no answer. The moderator tried to pivot. A seasoned journalist asked her about tone, about whether her style encouraged division. She turned slightly, met his eyes, and said, "You've mistaken clarity for aggression. That's not on me." The room cracked. Quietly, internally. Eyes flicked toward one another. The host scribbled notes and didn't look up again. The camera stayed fixed on her. Ratings teams backstage messaged producers, "Keep the feed live." And just like that, the forum slipped from their hands. Afterward, she didn't linger. She shook a few hands, gave no interviews, and left through a side exit before most attendees had even returned from the bathroom. And that, too, made a statement. The backlash came fast, but not because of what she said, because of what it did. Viewers saw it, heard it, and they didn't just remember her. They remembered the silence after she spoke, the inability of anyone else to challenge her without sounding dated, distracted, or desperate. So they escalated. In less than 48 hours, 3 major networks ran coordinated specials, panel after panel, headline after headline. Is Karoline Leavitt a threat to democracy? Too fast, too far. The dangers of political celebrity, when ambition crosses the line. They dug up everything: photos, friends, an old speech she gave in college, spliced to imply contradiction, a misinterpreted quote, a distorted clip. Someone leaked text messages from years ago. Another hinted at foreign money, foreign influence. None of it stuck, but none of it needed to. They wanted the noise to overtake the signal. It didn't work, because her followers weren't just supporters now. They were protectors. They amplified the truth faster than the lies could spread. Every distorted clip was answered with the full version. Every accusation met with documents, timestamps, context. The public wasn't just listening. It was watching the machine try to bury something it couldn't kill. Then came the summit, a private event, Ultra exclusive. No press, no cameras. Only the most powerful. It was never announced publicly. It wasn't supposed to be leaked, but it was, because someone inside had already chosen a side. The recording wasn't grainy, it was clear, and it started mid-sentence. An elected official speaking bluntly. We need to take her off the board before she rewrites the game. The voices were familiar. Strategists, donors, anchors, politicians. I don't care if it's illegal. I care if it works. That sentence broke the last dam. The leak exploded. It wasn't theory anymore. It was confession. The system wasn't protecting the country. It was protecting itself. And Karoline? She said nothing for 6 hours. Then she posted one sentence. I'm not fighting them because they hate me. I'm fighting them because they fear you. That post became the most shared political message in the platform's history. The media collapsed into chaos. Lawsuits flew. Networks denied involvement. One anchor was suspended. A high-profile aide resigned before the press could reach him. 3 senators issued statements filled with damage control that only raised more questions. And Karoline? She booked a stadium. No headliners, no artists, just her and a microphone. They expected a crowd of 10,000. 45,000 showed up. She walked on stage. No teleprompter, no entourage, just a single sheet of paper, which she folded in half and never read. She looked out at them and said, "They told me to wait. They told me to learn my place. But what they forgot, what they always forget, is that I was never asking for permission. The roar could be heard for blocks. They thought humiliating one actor would be the end of it. But it wasn't about him. It was about all of them. It started before sunrise. A kind of stillness that didn't belong in November. Cities that were usually loud by 5 lay suspended in a kind of breathless pause. Not silence, just anticipation, stretched thin and electric. The polls weren't just statistical, they were volatile. Traditional forecasts failed weeks ago. Algorithms scrambled. Insider briefings contradicted each other. Networks offered cautious optimism, then drowned it in caveats. Because for the first time in decades, the system wasn't confident, not about who would win, but about whether it could stop her from doing it. Karoline Leavitt had no campaign headquarters in the traditional sense. Her war room was a single dimly lit floor in a repurposed mill in New Hampshire, staffed by fewer than 40 people. No consultants, no spin teams, just data, silence, and discipline. Her team spoke rarely and worked constantly. They weren't trying to manage the news cycle, they were trying to end it. By noon, panic had already begun spreading in the capital. Turnout was massive, but not in the precincts that usually delivered victory. The suburbs weren't behaving. College towns were unpredictable. Rural counties were overperforming. More alarmingly, urban youth were showing up in numbers not seen in a generation, and they weren't wearing anyone's colors. Just black, gray, unbranded, a quiet army. Exit polls were inconclusive. Voters refused to answer. Many said they were undecided even as they left the booth smiling. That terrified the pollsters, because undecided doesn't grin. The establishment tried to comfort itself with numbers. It's still early. Mail-in ballots will balance it. Suburban women will break late. But none of the old assurances had weight anymore. They were recited more like ritual than strategy. Karoline hadn't been seen in public for 40 hours. That too was intentional. She gave no closing rally, no final interview, no feel-good montage. Just a 2-minute video, a grainy black and white shot of her walking into a quiet voting booth and dropping her ballot in. The caption read, "If they can't beat you fairly, they'll try to erase you silently. Walk in anyway." It was the most viewed political post in the history of the internet. At 4:17 p.m., a New York Times analyst published a cryptic tweet. "We're seeing movement in counties that shouldn't move. Something's broken." Then he deleted it. Screenshots flew across the web. By 6 a.m., cable news anchors were visibly shaken. The map was shifting. Not red, not blue, just strange. States that hadn't flipped in decades were too early to call. Anchor voices cracked as they repeated the phrase, "unprecedented early turnout among first-time voters in non-traditional districts." Karoline still hadn't spoken. Then at 7:46 p.m., she appeared. Not on TV, not on a live stream. She walked into a small church basement in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where 100 volunteers had been working quietly, unbothered by press or punditry. She didn't give a speech. She didn't ask for applause. She sat down beside an old woman counting precinct sheets and asked if she needed help. A single photo captured it. Her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, sorting stacks of handwritten logs like a staffer. It went viral within minutes. The hashtag changed. It wasn't her name anymore. It was the word "we." The networks didn't know how to handle it, because every time they cut to her, she was somewhere unglamorous. Folding chairs, cafeterias, parking lots, no stage, no campaign song, just movement. Then came 9 p.m., the first official call. Florida. For her. Not because of Cuban districts or retirees, because of high school seniors who had turned 18 in the last 30 days and waited in line for 6 hours. Because of neighborhoods where no one had voted in 20 years, now filled with hundreds asking, "Where do I sign?" Then came Ohio. Then came Michigan. Pennsylvania remained too close to call, but every shift in the numbers made pundits look like ghosts reading tea leaves. The White House was silent. Her opposition hadn't posted in hours. There were no concession leaks, no early victory tweets, just frozen silence. By midnight, she had 264 electoral votes, and still she hadn't said a word, because words didn't matter anymore. The movement wasn't built on speeches. It was built on fracture, of trust, of narrative, of ownership, and in that fracture, she hadn't tried to rebuild the old system. She had built a new one. Not polished, not clean, just real and relentless. Then at 12:47 a.m., Pennsylvania flipped, then Wisconsin, then Arizona, and then the number, 270. No fireworks, no theme music, just one sound. 1,000 people in a gymnasium, staring at a screen, blinking, and realizing the world had just changed. She still didn't speak. Not until 1:06 a.m., when she walked outside, alone, into the cold night air of a town that had never seen a president, and said one sentence: "I don't need to be celebrated. I need you to stay awake." And that was it, because the celebration didn't belong to her. It belonged to a country that had remembered it still had breath, and the rest of the world, it was watching. Because within minutes, hashtags began lighting up in other languages. From France, from India, from Brazil, from regions where protests had failed, where change had been swallowed by bureaucracy. Her name wasn't just a name anymore. It was a signal. The machine isn't untouchable. If you stand still long enough, someone will walk through it. And she had, alone, and completely unstoppable. They didn't clap at her inauguration, not the way they were supposed to. Yes, the crowd cheered. The music played. The oath was taken, clean and word perfect. But there was no swelling applause from the rows of lawmakers behind her. Some stood, most did not. And those who did kept their hands clenched tight to their sides, eyes forward, as if applauding would make it real. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She didn't look over her shoulder. She faced the cameras, raised her chin, and spoke 12 minutes. No metaphors, no stories about founding fathers or melting pots or shining cities on hills. Just numbers, policies, deadlines. Her final sentence: "I'm not here to make history. I'm here to end the excuses." Then she walked off without turning back. By nightfall, the damage control had already begun. Editorials framed her tone as abrasive, unconventional, non-presidential. A former staffer from the losing campaign called her speech a cold contract with no soul. But the footage didn't lie. It played on loop. No flourishes, no winks. Just accountability, delivered with surgical calm. Day 1, she signed an executive order reducing federal consulting contracts by 60%. 30 lobbyists resigned that afternoon. Cable news ran breaking coverage about job loss. Day 2, she dissolved 3 internal commissions, commissions that hadn't met in 2 years, but still received $12 million in funding. The headlines screamed rash government dismantling. No one asked what those commissions did. Day 4, she walked into the Department of Education unannounced, asked for the latest student loan servicing numbers, and when they couldn't produce them within an hour, fired the deputy secretary in front of his staff. The footage leaked. It was brutal, precise, final. By day 8, she had earned a nickname, not from supporters, from her enemies, the Eraser, because she wasn't building a new empire. She was tearing out the old foundation brick by brick, and each time a layer collapsed, something horrifying became clear. She didn't need their approval, because her power didn't come from behind the desk. It came from every forgotten room in America where someone had voted, not for her, but against the machine. And the machine knew it. It began to adapt. By day 15, the pushback stopped being subtle. A classified leak from the Pentagon questioned her foreign policy readiness. Then came the diplomatic snubs. 2 ambassadors recalled without explanation. An allied prime minister issued a vague statement about stability. European papers called her an American storm. She responded by cutting 20% of White House press briefings and reallocating the time to live-stream town halls with unfiltered questions from the public. Ratings shattered. The media flinched. And yet, they kept digging. By day 21, 4 former aides were subpoenaed in unrelated investigations. All old cases, all irrelevant, all timed perfectly. Headlines were written in advance. She didn't flinch. She released her entire staff's financial disclosures online, unredacted, then said nothing. The public's trust in her doubled overnight. That's when the world started to shake. Protests broke out in other countries, masses gathering not against her, but for what she represented. In Berlin, in Buenos Aires, in Lagos, signs with her face, her quotes, her silence, and the phrase that had become untouchable. If they can't beat you fairly, they'll try to erase you silently. And the old powers, both here and abroad, realized something. She wasn't just a domestic disruption. She was a global signal. By day 30, the IMF issued a warning. Markets were unsettled. Regulatory bodies concerned. A European finance minister warned of a populist contagion. She was asked about it during a press gaggle while walking to Marine One. She paused, turned to the camera and said, "You don't warn people about contagion unless you're afraid it's working." She boarded the helicopter without waiting for the next question. Inside the White House, the hallways were stripped of portraits. She had them moved, not as an insult, but as a reset. "We're not here to worship ghosts," she told her staff. "We're here to fix the mess they left behind." By day 43, the private sector pushed back.